The Velkaran Empire had marked Earth as extinct 300 years ago, and their scanners showed a dead world stripped of electromagnetic signatures and devoid of the radio chatter that once made the small blue planet so noisy in the galactic spectrum. Commander Zethra of the survey vessel Infinite Reach had reviewed the historical data himself, and humanity had been observed and catalogued and ultimately written off when their signals went dark in what the Velkaran had assumed was a self-inflicted nuclear catastrophe that ended their civilization forever. Now, the Velkaran needed Earth's strategic position, and located at the intersection of 3 major hyperspace lanes, the planet would make an ideal refueling station and military outpost for their expansion into the Orion arm. The Council had approved the colonization effort without debate because, after all, who would oppose them on a graveyard world where nothing lived and nothing breathed and nothing fought back? The colonization fleet dropped out of hyperspace on the edge of Earth's solar system, and 15 massive carrier ships, each housing thousands of settlers and enough military hardware to level a continent, appeared in the darkness of space. Zethra stood on the bridge of the flagship Eternal, dawn in his 4 eyes scanning the view screen as the small blue-green planet came into focus, and he felt satisfied that this mission would be simple and straightforward and complete within a few weeks. He ordered his crew to begin preliminary scans because he wanted detailed atmospheric readings and surface composition analysis before they committed the landing parties to the surface. His second officer was a young female named Kiraset, and she worked her console with practiced efficiency, and her translator device clicking softly as she processed the incoming data from the scanning arrays. The initial scans confirmed the planet was habitable with an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere and abundant water and moderate temperatures across most land masses. There were no satellite networks detected, and no orbital structures, and no signs of spacefaring civilization that might pose any threat to their colonization efforts. But then Kiraset paused, and her translator device clicked nervously, and Zethra noticed the change in her body language immediately. He demanded to know what was wrong, and she reported that she was detecting power signatures that were faint but widespread across the northern and southern continents. There was something else too, and thermal signatures, consistent with industrial activity and large population centers that perhaps housed millions of living beings. Before Zethra could process this information, the communications console erupted with an alert tone that made every Velkaran on the bridge stiffen with fear. The communications officer reported an incoming transmission that was audio only, and shockingly, it was in their language. Zethra felt his blood chill as he ordered the transmission to be put on speaker, and a human voice that was male and unnervingly calm filled the bridge with words that should have been impossible. The voice identified itself as Earth Defense Command and stated that the Velkaran vessels were entering restricted space and demanded they state their intentions immediately or face being fired upon. The bridge fell silent, and Zethra's mind raced with possibilities because humans were supposed to be dead and extinct and gone from the universe. Kiraset whispered that this must be a remnant population, and perhaps survivors hiding in bunkers deep underground, who had managed to cling to life for 3 centuries, but Zethra was not convinced because that voice had carried authority and confidence and not the desperation of a dying species begging for mercy. He responded carefully and identified himself as Commander Zethra of the Velkaran Empire, and explained that their records indicated this world was uninhabited and they meant no harm and merely sought to establish a peaceful colony. The human voice cut him off and stated flatly that their records were wrong and this was their only warning, and they must change course or face the consequences. The transmission ended abruptly, and Zethra stood in silence as his crew looked to him for orders and guidance. He gestured sharply and cut the transmission and turned to his tactical officer and demanded to know what military assets the humans could possibly have. He wanted numbers and capabilities and threat assessments because he needed to understand what he was facing. The tactical officer worked frantically at his console and reported scattered radar installations and possibly defense bunkers and what might be aircraft, but nothing that should threaten their shields. The officer concluded that the humans were bluffing, and they had to be because a dead civilization could not possibly have maintained any serious military capability. Zethra considered his options carefully, and the council expected results, and returning empty-handed because of a hollow Threat from a supposedly dead species would destroy his career and possibly his life. He had brought 15 carrier ships and thousands of soldiers in the most advanced military technology the Velcaran Empire could produce. He made his decision and ordered the fleet to proceed to standard orbit and battle. Shields were brought to full power and weapons were armed but held in reserve. He wanted to see if the humans had teeth behind their bark and if they were truly capable of resisting the might of the Velcaran Empire. The 15 ships moved deeper into Earth's space in their massive hulls, casting shadows across the lunar surface as they approached the blue-green planet. Zethra watched the tactical display and waited for any sign of the promised resistance, but the scanners showed nothing, and no missiles launching, and no energy weapons charging, and no fleet rising to meet them. Perhaps the humans were bluffing, after all, and perhaps they had no capability to back up their threats, and perhaps this would be easier than he thought. But something deep in his mind whispered that he was making a mistake and that underestimating these humans might cost him everything. 3 miles beneath the Colorado Rockies, Captain Jake Morrison stood in the command center and watched 15 hostile vessels descend toward Earth like a plague of locusts, bringing death and destruction. Around him, dozens of officers worked their stations with focused intensity, and their faces illuminated by the glow of holographic displays that showed every movement of the enemy fleet. Lieutenant Katie Sullivan reported from the tactical station that the enemy was not turning away, and 15 capital ships, all with shields active and weapons hot, were calling their bluff and preparing to establish orbit. Jake allowed himself a grim smile and thought about the 300 years humanity had spent preparing for this exact moment. He gave the order calmly and told Katie to activate Defense Grid Alpha and target the lead ship only and fire one warning shot to show these aliens that humanity was not dead and not defenseless, and not willing to surrender their home without a fight. Around the planet, systems that had remained dormant for nearly a century roared to life, and humanity had gone silent by choice and not by extinction. After the resource wars had nearly destroyed them in the 21st century, the survivors had made a collective decision to go dark and rebuild in secret and never again be vulnerable to those who might see Earth as an easy target. They had watched the galaxy, and they had listened to every transmission, and they had learned from every alien broadcast that rippled through space. Humanity had taken 300 years to transform from a fractured, desperate species into something far more dangerous and far more capable than anyone could imagine. From a concealed installation on the lunar surface, a railgun the size of a skyscraper aligned its barrel toward the Velcaran flagship. The mathematics were calculated in microseconds, and trajectory and velocity and energy expenditure were all precisely measured. The goal was not to destroy the ship, but to make it hurt and make it understand that humanity was serious about defending their home. The tungsten projectile left the railgun at a significant fraction of the speed of light, and it crossed the distance between the moon and the Velcaran flagship in less than 2 seconds. Aboard the Eternal Dawn, Commander Zethra barely had time to register the energy spike on his sensors before the impact came. The projectile punched through their shield like it was made of vapor and tore through the ship's outer hull and vaporized 3 decks instantly and exited out the other side. Before the Velcaran computers even registered what had happened, the flagship shuddered violently. An alarm screamed throughout the vessel, and atmosphere vented from the wound in explosive decompression before emergency bulkheads sealed the breach. Zethra roared for a report and gripped his command chair as the ship stabilized and tried to understand what weapon could possibly penetrate their shields. Kiraset shouted over the chaos that they had taken a direct hit on the starboard side, and 73 casualties were reported and 6 decks were compromised, and she could not explain how that round went through their shield. Their shields could withstand plasma bombardment from 3 Krell battleships, and yet this single projectile from a dead civilization had pierced it like paper. Another transmission cut through the panic, and the same calm human voice spoke. Again, the voice stated that the previous shot was their warning, and the next one would go through their bridge, and they had 30 seconds to begin their retreat, or Earth would open fire with everything they had. The human began counting down in 29 and 28, and the numbers ticked away like a death sentence. Zethra stared at the tactical display, and his ship, which was the pride of the Velcaran fleet, had just been effortlessly wounded by humans who were supposed to be extinct. His instincts screamed at him to run and save his crew and abandon this mission, but his pride and his career and the weight of imperial expectation held him in place. The countdown continued, and 20 and 19 and 18 and Zethra made his decision. He ordered all carriers to launch fighters and deploy combat wings, because if these humans wanted a fight, then the Velcaran Empire would give them one. He would show them what happened when you threatened the greatest military power in this sector of the galaxy. The countdown stopped, and the human voice spoke softly and said, "So be it." From every continent and from the oceans and from the moon, and from Mars and from hidden stations in the asteroid belt humanities, true arsenal revealed itself to the Velcaran fleet. The sky above Earth lit up with streaks of light as thousands of missiles climbed toward orbit and railguns fired in synchronized salvos that created patterns of destruction in space. Energy weapons that had taken 2 centuries to perfect carved through the void and struck Velcaran, shields with devastating precision. Rising from concealed hangars scattered across the planet, and from underground bases and camouflaged airfields came Earth's fighter corps. Sleek angular craft moved with predatory grace, and each one was piloted by a human who had trained their entire life for this moment. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper gripped the controls of his fighter with the callsign Razor 4 as he cleared the atmosphere and felt the familiar rush of combat. Around him, 300 other fighters formed up in attack, wings and their targeting systems already painting the Velcaran carriers with glowing red icons. "Commander," Lisa Hayes spoke over the tactical channel, and her voice was steady and professional. She told all wings that these aliens thought humanity was dead, and now they would show them how wrong they were. She gave the order to engage at will, and Ryan felt his heart pound with anticipation. Ryan's fighter screamed forward, and E-forces pressed him back into his seat even through the inertial dampeners that helped his body survive the acceleration. He selected a cluster of incoming Velcaran fighters and locked weapons and whispered "Welcome to Earth" as his finger moved to the trigger. His missiles flew true and struck 3 enemy fighters in rapid succession, and explosions bloomed in space like deadly flowers. The Velcaran pilots tried to evade, but they were too slow and too predictable and too unprepared for the ferocity of human combat. Tactics Commander Zethra watched in mounting horror as his fighter screen was systematically shredded and destroyed. The humans moved like nothing he had ever seen, and their craft executed maneuvers that should have liquefied their pilots from the extreme forces. His tactical officer shouted numbers that made no sense, and 12G turns and 15G acceleration burns and reaction, times that suggested the pilots were anticipating moves before they happened. Kiraset demanded to know how they were doing. This because those G-forces should kill any living being. But the humans did not die, and they did not slow down, and they did not show any mercy to the Velcaran fighters that fell before them like wheat before a scythe. The humans had spent 3 centuries learning to push their biological limits and enhancing their pilots with medical technology that let them survive forces that would turn a Velcaran into nothing. Every pilot in that swarm had trained in centrifuges since childhood, and their bodies were conditioned and their reflexes honed to absolute perfection. Ryan Cooper rolled his fighter through a cloud of debris that used to be 2 Velcaran interceptors and his targeting computer already locked onto the next threat. The enemy pilots were good and well-trained, but they fought like they were afraid to die, and that made them hesitate, and that hesitation was fatal. Ryan and his fellow pilots had been raised on stories of humanity's near extinction and of the desperate last stands their ancestors had made against starvation and disease and each other. They were not afraid of death because they understood that some things were worth dying for, and Earth was one of them. Ryan's wingman was Lieutenant Amy Carter, and she warned him that he had 3 bandits on his 6 o'clock position closing fast. Ryan acknowledged and broke left and threw his fighter into a spiral that would have knocked out a Velcaran pilot instantly and let the pursuing craft overshoot his position. They passed him. Ryan inverted his fighter and fired his maneuvering thrusters and came up behind them in a perfect attack position. 3 short bursts from his particle cannons and the Velcaran fighters vanished in brief flowers of flame and debris. He reported calmly that he had splashed 3 more enemy fighters and continued scanning for his next target, but the battle was bigger than any single fighter could control, and the Velcaran carriers had begun launching their ground assault craft. Massive troop transports that could carry 1,000 soldiers each descended toward Earth's atmosphere, and they clearly hoped to bypass the space battle and establish a beachhead on the surface. The transports made it approximately 400 kilometers before Earth's orbital defense platforms acquired them and locked on, hidden among the debris field that humanity had deliberately maintained. In their orbital space and disguised as defunct satellites and space junk, the weapons platforms activated, with lethal purpose. Laser arrays designed for point defense tracked the slow-moving transports, and electromagnetic pulse cannons charged to full power. More of those devastating railguns that had crippled the Velkaran flagship aligned their barrels and calculated firing solutions with cold mathematical precision. The assault transports did not stand a chance against this coordinated attack. The first transport exploded when 3 railgun rounds struck it simultaneously, and the second was cut in half by a sustained laser barrage. The third tried to turn back, but an EMP blast disabled its systems, and it tumbled helplessly into the atmosphere, where it burned up like a meteor. Captain Jake Morrison watched from his command center as the battle unfolded. Across multiple screens and holographic displays, the tactical display showed the Velkaran formation beginning to fragment under the sustained assault, and they had brought overwhelming force to claim an undefended world. But they had found a hornet's nest instead. Lieutenant Katie Sullivan reported that the enemy flagship was attempting to break orbit, and the other carriers were following suit in a desperate attempt to escape. Jake ordered all ships to intercept and told them not to let the Velkaran leave without understanding the cost of threatening Earth. From their hiding positions throughout the solar system, Earth's capital ships revealed themselves to the enemy. They were not the massive dreadnoughts that dominated galactic warfare, but smaller, faster cruisers built on a philosophy the aliens had not encountered before, which was mobility over armor and precision over raw power. The EDS Defiant, under the command of Captain Helen Price, was the first to intercept the fleeing Velkaran flagship. Her ship screamed toward the eternal dawn on an intercept course that would have been suicidal if the Velkaran had time to bring their heavy guns to bear, but Helen did not give them that time. She commanded all batteries to fire as they bore, and the Defiant's railguns spoke with authority. The Velkaran flagship staggered under the impact, and more hull breaches appeared along its port side. An atmosphere vented into space and frozen clouds. Zethra's world had collapsed into chaos, and his flagship was dying around him. The bridge was filled with smoke and sparks, and the screams of injured crew members and emergency lights cast everything in a hellish red glow. Around him, his fleet was burning, and 15 carriers had been reduced to 9, and those 9 were fleeing in disorder toward the edge of the system. Kiris had pleaded with him that they needed to jump to hyperspace now, because if they did not reach the hyperspace threshold soon, they would all die here. Zethra snarled that he knew this, but his pride was wounded as badly as his ship, and the shame of this defeat burned worse than the fires consuming his vessel. The two-eyed humans were not done with them yet, and they pursued like wolves harrying wounded prey. Their smaller ships darted in to deliver punishing blows before retreating out of range of the Velkaran's heavy weapons, and it was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare that Zethra had no answer for. Ryan Cooper's fighter group had shifted from engaging the fighter screen to strafing runs on the fleeing carriers. His weapons were barely scratching their heavy armor, but every hit degraded their shields and slowed their retreat and bought time for the heavier human ships to catch up and deliver killing blows. He transmitted that this was Razor 4 beginning his attack run, and lined up on one of the damaged carriers that was trailing behind the others. As he dove toward his target, his radar warning receiver screamed. An alert, and a Velkaran point defense laser had locked onto him. Ryan broke hard and dumped chaff and flares, but he felt the fighter shudder as the beam grazed his port wing. Systems alarms blared in his cockpit, and he fought the controls as the fighter began to lose attitude control and threatened to spin out. He reported that Razor 4 was hit and losing attitude control, and his voice remained calm despite the danger. Commander Lisa Hayes ordered him to break off and return to base immediately, but Ryan could see his target, wounded and limping and struggling to escape. He told her negative and said he still had weapons and could make one more run. Lisa repeated that it was an order and told him to break off now. Ryan gritted his teeth and fought against every instinct that told him to press the attack and finish what he started. But he had been trained to follow orders, and more importantly, to trust his commanders, because they saw the bigger picture. There would be other battles and other chances to prove himself, and staying alive to fight another day was more important than one kill. He acknowledged the order and reported that Razor 4 was breaking off. As his damaged fighter limped back toward Earth, he watched the rest of the human fleet complete what he had started, and the damaged Velcarin carrier took a final railgun round through its main reactor. The explosion was brief and brilliant and visible even through his polarized canopy. The carrier broke apart in sections and debris scattered across thousands of kilometers of space, and Ryan felt a grim satisfaction knowing that ship would never threaten Earth again. By the time the surviving Velcarin ships reached the hyperspace jump point, they had lost 8 carriers and 3/4 of their fighter complement and nearly all their ground assault forces. Commander Zethra stood on the shattered bridge of the Eternal Dawn and took one last look at the blue-green planet that had destroyed his fleet and his career and possibly his life. The humans had broadcast a final message as the Velcarin fled, and the transmission was clear and direct and carried a weight that made every surviving alien crew member feel cold fear. The message stated that they should tell their empire what happened here and tell them Earth remembers and tell them that humanity was done hiding from the galaxy. The jump to hyperspace was a mercy for Zethra and his surviving crew because it meant they could finally escape this nightmare. The Eternal Dawn lurched sickeningly as it entered the hyperspace corridor, and the blue-green planet vanished from view and was replaced by the swirling colors of faster-than-light travel. Zethra collapsed into his command chair and looked around at his destroyed bridge. Half his crew was dead or injured, and the ship was barely holding together, and he knew his career was finished. But more than his personal failure, he understood that the Velcarin Empire had made a terrible mistake, and they had underestimated a species they should have left alone. Kiraset approached him carefully, and her body language showed exhaustion and fear. She asked quietly what they would tell the High Council and how they would explain this catastrophic defeat. Zethra looked at her with his 4 eyes and told her they would tell the truth no matter how painful it was. The truth was that humanity had never been extinct, and they had been watching and waiting and preparing for 300 years. The truth was that Earth was defended by warriors who fought with a ferocity and skill that the Velcarin had never encountered. The truth was that the Empire had sent 15 carriers to claim an easy prize, and only 7 were limping home. Back on Earth, the celebrations were muted because even though they had won this battle, the cost was still real. 12 fighters had been lost and their pilots killed in action, and 3 of the orbital defense platforms had been destroyed by Velcarin missiles before they could be shot down. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the command center and watched as the last Velcarin signatures vanished from their long-range sensors. Lieutenant Katie Sullivan reported that all enemy vessels had left the solar system and Earth's space was secure once again. Jake nodded and told her to stand down from battle stations but keep the defense grid on alert. He knew this victory was just the beginning and not the end, because word would spread through the galaxy now. Humanity had revealed itself, and there was no going back to the silent centuries of hiding. He walked through the command center and stopped at each station to thank his officers personally for their service. These men and women had trained for this moment their entire lives, and when the test came, they had performed flawlessly. But Jake also knew that the real test was yet to come. Ryan Cooper was in the medical bay getting his injured arm treated, and the crash landing had been rough, but he had survived. His fighter was a total loss, but that did not matter, because fighters could be rebuilt and trained pilots were far more valuable. Amy Carter sat beside him, and despite her own injuries, she was grinning from ear to ear. She said they had actually done it, and sent the aliens running back to wherever they came from. Ryan smiled, but his expression was more serious than hers. He told her that this was just the first battle, and the Velcarin would come back eventually. Maybe not them specifically, but someone else would hear about what happened and decide to test humanity's defenses. Amy's grin faded slightly, and she nodded because she understood the truth of his words. Ryan continued and said that meant they needed to be ready always and train harder and never let their guard down. Amy agreed and said that humanity would always be ready, because they had learned the hard way that the galaxy was not a safe place. In the weeks that followed, the battle word spread through the galactic community, faster than anyone expected. The Velcarin survivors told their story, and other species listened with varying degrees of interest and concern. Some were curious about these humans who had hidden for 3 centuries, and some were worried about what this meant for the balance of power. The Krell Confederacy, which was known for its aggressive military culture, was particularly intrigued. They sent diplomatic messages to Earth requesting contact and expressing interest in meeting these warriors, who had defeated a Velcaran fleet. Jake and the other Earth commanders discussed these messages carefully and decided to respond cautiously. The Galactic Trade Council also reached out and offered Earth membership and access to interstellar commerce routes. They explained that any species capable of defending itself so effectively deserved a place at the table of civilized worlds. Again, the Earth leaders discussed carefully because opening their world to trade meant opening it to potential threats. Commander Lisa Hayes addressed her assembled fighter wings in the main hangar bay and stood before 300 pilots who had proven themselves in combat. She told them that they had reminded the galaxy of something important, and that humans do not give up and do not surrender and do not go quietly into extinction. She continued, and said they had fought with honor and skill and courage, and they had shown what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of predators. The pilots stood at attention and listened as their commander spoke with pride in her voice. Lisa explained that the Velcaran thought Earth was dead, and now the whole galaxy knew the truth. Earth lives and humanity endures, and anyone who threatens their home will face the full fury of a species that learned to fight in the ashes of near destruction. She paused and looked across the faces of her pilots and saw the determination there. These were not just soldiers following orders, but defenders of humanity who understood what they were protecting. They had families and homes and a future worth fighting for. The message Earth sent to the galaxy was becoming clear through actions rather than words. Humanity was here, and they had survived the worst that their own world could throw at them. They had emerged stronger and more united, and more dangerous than any alien species had anticipated. In the command centers and aboard the ships and in the hearts of every human who had fought in that brief, brutal battle, one truth was understood completely. They had announced themselves to the galaxy not as victims or refugees, but as survivors and warriors, and a species that would never again be underestimated or threatened without consequence. The Velcaran High Council assembled an emergency session 3 days after the survivors of the colonization fleet limped back to their home system, and the council chamber was filled with tension and anger and fear. Commander Zethra stood before them, knowing his career was already over and his life might be forfeit, but he had a duty to report the truth. About what happened at Earth, he told them. Simply that humans were never extinct, and they had watched the galaxy for 3 centuries. They studied every alien transmission and learned from every species they observed. And then they prepared for the day when someone would come to take what was theirs. The council members, representing a dozen Velcaran worlds, shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they reviewed the battle recordings. The losses had been tallied, and 8 carriers destroyed and thousands of soldiers and pilots dead. The implications were staggering for an empire that had conquered 50 worlds without significant resistance. Counselor Vashira demanded to know how they missed this and how 300 years of silence led them to conclude that humans were extinct. Zethra explained that the humans wanted them to think exactly that, and they had shut down their transmissions deliberately and went dark on purpose. While the Velcaran dismissed them as dead, the humans were building and training and preparing for inevitable contact with hostile species. They had turned their near extinction into a lesson and emerged as something far more dangerous than they had been before their collapse. Another counselor asked about human technology and pointed out that Velcaran ships had conquered 50 worlds easily. How did humans defeat them so thoroughly and so quickly with what should have been inferior technology? Zethra explained that humans fight differently than any species the Velcaran had encountered. The Empire seeks dominance through overwhelming force and massive fleets in superior numbers, but humans seek victory through precision and efficiency and perfect execution of their tactics. Every shot the humans fired was calculated, and every maneuver was practiced thousands of times, and every pilot knew exactly what to do in any situation. They do not fight for glory or honor or conquest like the Velcaran do, and instead they fight purely to survive, and that makes them far more dangerous. He continued and said that humans are willing to sacrifice everything to protect their home and their species. They do not hesitate, and they do not surrender, and they do not show mercy to those who threaten them. This mentality, combined with 3 centuries of preparation, made them nearly unstoppable. The council discussed the matter for hours, and some members argued for immediate retaliation with a larger fleet. Others counseled caution and suggested opening diplomatic channels instead of military ones. A few wise voices suggested leaving Earth alone entirely and marking it as restricted space. On Earth, Captain Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the Defense Command Center and looked up at a sky that was once again safe from immediate threats. Around the planet Repair, crews were already patching the few damages the Velcarin had managed to inflict during their brief battle. The fighters were returning to base and being serviced and rearmed for the next potential conflict. The dead were being honored with ceremonies that recognized their sacrifice. Families mourned their losses but also felt pride that their loved ones had defended humanity when it mattered. Most Lieutenant Katie Sullivan approached Jake with a datapad and reported that they were picking up transmissions across multiple alien communication networks. Word about Earth was spreading fast, and various species were discussing what this meant for galactic politics and trade and military alliances. Jake told her that this was good and they should let the galaxy talk and let everyone know that humanity exists. He said that anyone who comes to Earth looking for an easy conquest will learn the same lesson the Velcarin learned, and that lesson would be painful, and permanent Ryan Cooper had been released from the medical bay and was already back in the simulator training for the next battle. His arm was still healing, but he could fly, and that was all that mattered to him. He ran through combat scenarios and practiced maneuvers and studied recordings of the battle to see what he could improve. Amy Carter joined him in the simulator bay and asked if he ever took a break from training. Ryan smiled and told her that every moment of peace was just preparation for the next war. She understood because they had both been raised in a culture that valued readiness above almost everything else. They talked about what came next for humanity and whether opening contact with other species was wise. Ryan said they had no choice now because hiding was no longer possible after revealing their capabilities. Amy agreed and added that maybe it was better this way because living in silence meant living in fear. Around the world, similar conversations were happening as humanity grappled with its new place in the galaxy. For 300 years they had been ghosts watching from the shadows, and now they had stepped into the light. There was no going back, and the path forward was uncertain and dangerous. Captain Helen Price was aboard the EDS Defiant overseeing repairs to her ship when she received new orders from Earth Defense Command. Her vessel, along with 3 other cruisers, was being assigned to patrol the outer solar system and watch for any returning threats. She read the orders carefully and understood their importance because the Velcarin might return or another species might decide to test Earth's defenses. Humanity needed to remain vigilant and ready and never assume they were safe just because they won one battle in orbit around Mars construction. Crews were already building new defense platforms and expanding the network that had proven so effective. In the asteroid belt, mining operations were extracting resources to build more ships and more weapons. On Earth itself, factories were running at full capacity, producing fighters and missiles and ammunition. Humanity had revealed itself, and now it had to maintain the strength to back up its message. The galaxy was watching and testing and evaluating whether humans were truly as dangerous as the Velcarin defeat suggested. Every day that passed was another day of preparation for conflicts yet to come. Jake Morrison looked out at the stars and thought about the future and wondered what challenges awaited humanity. He knew there would be wars, and probably many of them, because the galaxy was not a peaceful place. But he also knew that humans had something most species lacked, which was experience, surviving against impossible odds. Earth had been through nuclear war and climate collapse and resource depletion and near extinction. Every human alive carried the genetic legacy of survivors who refused to quit when everything seemed lost. That legacy made them formidable and unpredictable, and dangerous to anyone who threatened them. The message was clear to any species. Listening, and Earth was no longer hidden, and humanity was no longer silent, and the galaxy would have to accept them as equals or face them as enemies, and either way humans were here to stay.